the political atmosphere in the United States feels heavier than it has in years. Tension hums in the background of daily life, spilling over into protests, rallies, and angry confrontations. Against this backdrop, an unusual story has started to unfold around Washington, one that feels like a sign of how deep the country's divisions have become. Several senior officials from Donald Trump's administration have reportedly packed up their belongings and moved into housing on U.S. military bases. The reason, at least according to those close to them, isn't luxury or convenience, it's safety. They say the threats have gotten too serious, too personal, too constant. When civilian political figures begin retreating behind the high fences and armed gates of military compounds, it sends a message far larger than the individual decisions involved. It reflects a moment where politics has turned so heated that even people used to public criticism feel physically unsafe living among the general population. The list of officials making this move reads like a who's who of the Trump administration's inner circle. Stephen Miller, the longtime policy advisor and speechwriter known for shaping Trump's immigration agenda, was one of the first to relocate after sustained harassment outside his home in Arlington, Virginia. His family reportedly endured protesters gathering outside, shouting through bullhorns, and posting their address online. Marco Rubio, serving as Secretary of State, is now said to be staying in quarters at Fort McNair, one of Washington's most historic military installations where the city's highest-ranking generals and admirals live. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, a decorated Army veteran and one of Trump's most vocal loyalists, reportedly occupies quarters 8 on the same base, paying roughly $400 to $600 a month for the privilege. Kristi Noem, who now heads Homeland Security, is reported to be staying in quarters 1 at Joint Base Anacostia, Bowling, a grand waterfront mansion typically reserved for the Coast Guard commandant. And Dan Driscoll, the Army Secretary, has moved into a residence at Joint Base Meyer, Henderson Hall. In total, at least 6 high-ranking officials are confirmed or suspected to be living on military property. According to investigative reports by The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The Daily Beast, these are not typical arrangements. Civilian appointees don't usually live on bases, much less in residences meant for 4-star generals. There are rules about this, and they exist for a reason. The American system depends on a clear separation between civilian governance and military authority. When that boundary begins to blur, it makes people uneasy. Critics are calling these moves unprecedented, even dangerous, not because of any one individual's decision, but because of what it represents, a creeping normalization of political figures turning to the military for refuge from the public they serve. The officials themselves and their supporters argue that the threat environment leaves them little choice. They point to the increasing number of violent incidents linked to politics in recent years, attempted assassinations, threats against lawmakers, and harassment at officials' homes. The phrase, political violence at a fever pitch, has appeared in multiple reports, capturing the feeling of a country on edge. FBI and DHS have both documented a sharp rise in politically motivated threats and attacks. Online, the rhetoric has grown uglier. Protests outside private homes have become common. Families of politicians have been targeted by name. It's no wonder, they argue, that officials are seeking the protection of secure military facilities. After all, a base offers 24-hour security, restricted entry, and anonymity. For some, it's the only way to sleep soundly. But opponents of the practice see something far more troubling in this migration. They argue that it symbolizes a democracy pulling away from its people. When civilian officials choose to live behind military gates, they're not just protecting themselves, they're isolating themselves. That separation, critics say, feeds a growing sense of alienation between those in power and the citizens who are supposed to have access to them. It creates the image of a government hunkering down, literally walling itself off from dissent, and it risks politicizing the military by placing partisan figures inside spaces meant to remain neutral. The symbolism of a Trump cabinet taking up residence on military soil is powerful, and not necessarily in a good way. Even though many of the officials involved are paying rent at market rates, the optics are still jarring. These bases are traditionally sanctuaries for service members and their families, not political figures under public scrutiny. Critics question whether this is truly about security or about control and image. They ask who approved these moves, whether taxpayer money is covering any costs, and what precedent it sets for future administrations. If the line between military protection and political privilege starts to blur, where does it stop? Some lawmakers have already begun raising questions. Members of Congress from both parties have reportedly asked for explanations from the Pentagon and the Department of Homeland Security. They want to know under what legal authority these officials are living on base housing, and whether it displaces military families or incurs extra costs for maintenance and security. Legally, the rules are murky. The Secretary of Defense and certain military leaders are authorized by law to occupy designated quarters, but it's far less clear whether those same privileges extend to non-defense cabinet members like the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Homeland Security. Previous ethics memos from earlier administrations have warned against blurring these lines. There's also the matter of optics. If the military is perceived as providing refuge or privilege to one political faction, it could undermine the institution's credibility and neutrality. On the other hand, there's the undeniable reality of increased risk. Reports have cited a growing list of threats, including doxing, cyber harassment, and direct intimidation of public officials. For people like Stephen Miller or Kristi Noem, whose political identities are polarizing, the fear is real. They've been targeted before and have legitimate reasons to worry for their families. In that context, a move onto a secure base doesn't seem like excess, it feels like self-preservation. Even so, the broader consequences can't be ignored. If more officials follow this path, Washington could begin to resemble a fortress, with top figures living in protected bubbles, disconnected from the day-to-day lives of the citizens they represent. That's a dangerous direction for any democracy. Political leaders need to be both safe and visible, secure yet accessible. Retreating behind military fences might solve one problem while deepening another. It also puts the military in a difficult position. Bases are not designed to be safe havens for civilian politicians, and the presence of partisan figures could create tension among the ranks. Soldiers are expected to remain neutral, but sharing space with politically charged figures could test that neutrality. Imagine being a young officer stationed at Fort McNair, living next door to a cabinet official whose policies or rhetoric are hotly debated across the nation. The military as a political culture could easily be strained by proximity to such controversies. Then there's the question of fairness. Some reports indicate that at least one of the officials, Kristi Noem, initially lived rent-free in her base residence, though later sources claim she reimbursed the government. Others, like Hegseth, are said to be paying full rent. Still, the perception of privilege remains. Many Americans struggle with housing costs, and the idea that top political figures are living in historic taxpayer-maintained homes on military property doesn't sit well. Critics argue that even if they pay market rent, the security, privacy, and exclusivity of such arrangements are privileges unavailable to ordinary citizens. Yet the officials involved frame it differently. They describe it not as privilege, but as a necessary shield against hostility. Some even see it as a sad reflection of how toxic politics has become. They argue that when public servants can no longer live among the public without fear, something fundamental is broken in the social contract. To them, the move to military bases is not a retreat from democracy, but a desperate adaptation to survive in an age of political extremism. It's a haunting argument because it contains a grain of truth. The climate really is volatile. Incidents of violence, threats, and harassment against officials of both parties have spiked. The murder of political figures, threats to judges, and attempted attacks on lawmakers have all been documented in recent years. Security agencies have repeatedly warned about the danger of radicalized individuals acting on political rage. In that sense, the trend of high-ranking officials retreating to fortified spaces mirrors the country's broader atmosphere, one of suspicion, hostility, and fear. Still, every democracy depends on its leaders maintaining a visible connection to the people. When that visibility disappears, even for understandable reasons, it risks eroding trust. Once public officials begin living in protected enclaves, the physical distance can translate into emotional distance. People begin to see their leaders not as representatives among them, but as a separate class hidden behind fences and guards. That perception feeds resentment, which in turn fuels the very anger and extremism that made those officials seek protection in the first place. It becomes a cycle of isolation and mistrust. What's happening in Washington today might therefore be more than just a security story. It's a snapshot of a democracy under stress. The relocation of Trump officials to military housing encapsulates how polarized the nation has become, how safety concerns now shape even the personal lives of public figures. It's about fear on one side, distrust on the other, and the uneasy presence of the military in the middle. Whether this trend continues or is reined in will depend on how the government balances legitimate safety concerns with democratic transparency. If the current trajectory holds, we could see more political leaders opting for the safety of the gates, more blurring of the lines between civilian authority and military power, and more distance between the rulers and the ruled. For now, it stands as a vivid symbol of an America that feels less like a single nation and more like a collection of walled-off camps, each guarded, each wary